I last did a video like this about 6 months ago, and in those 6 months, I've created a bunch of new games that I haven't posted anywhere other than one store, and so I decided I should spend some time doing that. So this week is all about marketing. To begin with, to not waste your time, I will summarize what I said in the last video, so this will kind of become like a running list of things you should and shouldn't do, in my opinion. And then I'm going to briefly talk about where I posted my games to and why I think you should post your games there too. And then I did something a little weird. Instead of talking about myself entirely like I usually do, I reached out to a bunch of game developers, including Jonas Tyroller and Vimlark, to ask their opinion on what their favorite social media platforms are, and what things they've tried to monetize their content, and whether or not they were actually successful doing that. And then I'm probably going to tick off a lot of people, because then I'm going to compare some numbers. But before we get into the video, my name is Helper Wesley, I've made these games, and I make weekly devlogs. So in the last video, I said, for marketing your games, you want to have good visuals, you want to sell it with a GIF, you want to make sure your tags and metadata and descriptions are up to date and matching your game, and then, for personal marketing, all I really touched on was having good visuals for your branding, and then linking your social media accounts together. If I find you on the internet and I want to see your stuff, I don't want to jump through 18 hoops and eventually have to look through Google to find you. Just put a link to your stuff on your accounts. Thank you. Okay, so what I did this week, I took all of the games that I have on itch and put those onto the other store pages that I have that I haven't been updating because the more store pages you have to manage, the more work it is. So therefore, the less games you make because you have to spend time updating store pages. And the balance wasn't right for me, so I kind of left that alone. Just updating my games on itch. Which is wrong because I use itch, GameJolt, and Newgrounds, and all three of those sites are great for different reasons. Itch is great for indies who want something. GameJolt, I've heard some really great things about from a lot of other people that I haven't experienced myself, but GameJolt is pretty great because it's like itch, but they seem more eager to get you money. And Newgrounds is the site that you go to when you want to get insulted. Anyhow, that's actually a great transition point, because Energy Supply, the game for the secret thing that I've talked about once or twice maybe, I was really proud of that game, and to see people give it such a low score and to leave comments like this, it hurts. It really does. Putting yourself out there so people can see your stuff, you have to remember that you're going to get insulted. I like to tell people about the first comment I ever received on my games ever, which was, I was going to comment on the game's art, but I didn't want to put in more work than you did. Yeah. So you really need a thick skin when you're putting yourself out there on social media. Speaking of thick skins, we're going to move on to the developers who were nice enough to give me the information I needed to make this video. Specifically to tell me a little bit about themselves and where they had their successes and failures. Now, to be fair, I reached out to most of these developers through Twitter, so it's going to be biased. And the information that I mainly collected, for numbers at least, was from YouTube and from Twitter. Just to be fair, I'm going to show mine before I show theirs. And you might see those ratios there in the middle, and we'll also get back to that later, but I'm calling those the success ratios because I really enjoy things like that. They're really not useful or productive in any way, shape, or form, but I'm just weird and I find those sorts of things fascinating. So, my favorite social media platform is Twitter. I've tried a couple of the other ones, and I've tried Reddit, and I got chased off, which I'm sure a lot of you can relate to if you've tried using Reddit to self-promote. But my favorite is Twitter, and this right here is the reason why. The advice that I would give to my past self, were I to understand how time travel worked and I could do that, would be to use hashtags. You see this blurb of hashtags right here? I use that to get a hold of bots and catch their attention so they share those things around the internet. Like, I have 300-ish followers, and somehow my tweets reach 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 sometimes people. Like, me as an individual with no platform to stand on should not be able to reach the attention of 5,000 people with a press of a button. So yeah, that's why I personally like Twitter. And my advice is to use hashtags. I sort of got those two things mixed up as I was talking, but that is my advice, and that is my favorite platform. As for monetization, I've found no success with basically anything. I've tried to sell video games, I've tried to get donations, I've tried Ko-Fi, or Coffee, or however you say it, and I've earned some money, but not nearly enough to quit my job yet. So let's get talking about the other developers that I got a hold of, who were nice enough to share their information with us. By the way, the links to their social media Twitter things, those are all down below. So let's start with Games by Saul. And their advice was, join Discords, Reddit, and Twitter. Use social media to share your project, and be sure to use popular hashtags like Screenshot Saturday. Followed by Wannabe Manisha, whose advice was, be authentic in your progress. Post often and consistently if you can. Don't be afraid to show off your work in progress. It doesn't need to be perfect, and I think people will appreciate that. Things can always blow up unexpectedly too. The social media world is unpredictable. Tim Bodette had this to say, get started. Too much time watching, reading, and trying to figure out how only keeps you from actually doing it. Followed by Xanderwood, whose advice was to start using Google Ads from day one. Followed by Wadi, who said this. They admitted they had no advice to give. They're just doing what they enjoy and not stressing about the little things. I'm sorry to this one, I've known them for a long time on the internet, but this is... And they said, be consistent and genuine, and eventually people will find you. Followed by Sidfish Games. They said, get to know some other game devs. And I'm gonna slip Jonas Tyroller, and I'm going to slip Jonas Tyroller here into the video, who is actually a really cool guy. Here's his information. I stopped here because I felt there were a couple interesting things about his story that needed to be shared, and one of those things that he told me about was that even with 105,000 subscribers, his YouTube doesn't make enough money for him to live off of. The largest part of his income that he lives off of is revenue from his earlier game, Islanders. And he's basically surviving off of two of those things together that will hopefully get him through to releasing the game he's working on now, which will then further pay for future projects. I just thought that was a really interesting thing to take in. Even with the success of a previous game and his YouTube channel and his following, he's still burning away through his savings to fund his next project. And I think that's just important to get your head around as you're working towards the whole game dev dream. One more thing he told me before we move on to his advice was that for Islanders, they didn't really talk about it or market or advertise the game until nearly having it finished, which goes against everything I've ever heard about ever with game marketing. So I'd like to bring your attention to a quote from another game developer who did a GDC talk on failing to fail.
Video games are young. Nobody knows anything. We're still scrambling to figure out, how do we design these things? How do we create these things? How do we test these things? How do we sell these things? How do we market these things? How do we add loot boxes to our $100 million project without causing to blow up on the launch pad? Nobody knows anything. And if you think you know a rule, one of you out there, your fortune and your fame might be figuring out the way to break that rule.
Nobody knows anything. So even though I'm talking about who's where, who's doing what, and holding them up as like, maybe this is the way to do things, none of them actually know. They're all just trying their best. So now that I've discredited everyone's advice, let's move on to Jonas Tyroller's advice. Don't spread yourself too thin. Focus most of your efforts on only one social media platform. Then pick one or two more to do on the side for a little diversification. The next developer on my list is The Gem Dev. And the advice that they gave was this. Don't use Twitter to promote your game. Twitter has a lot of developers. You need to find where the consumers are and go there. Followed by Nina. And their advice was this. Don't force videos to be longer than they need to be. Just practice making something and getting it out there. Followed by underfunded scientist, whose advice was this: be wherever the audience is. Then I got a hold of Adam from Rocco Games, who had this to say: focus on having something visual. Having something pretty to look at always strikes a chord with people. And then last on the list is Vimlark. The guy is always embroiled in some kind of jam or big project or something, so he's really hard to get a hold of. But here's the information he gave me. Vimlark is also a really cool guy. He doesn't have any major game successes like Jonas Tyroller does, but he comes from a marketing background, and so his insight on some of the things that we all want to do. But then again,
nobody knows anything.
And their advice was, playtest people's games and prototypes, and give thought-out feedback. Leave comments on people's videos, or hang out and chat during streams. That way when you show off stuff, people will know who you are, and will want to check it out. So thank you to all of those creators who were nice enough to share with me their experience with marketing. But now I might just piss them all off. Those ratios that I talked about earlier, they're basically the subscriber amount divided by the videos that they've released, or the follower amount divided by the number of tweets they'd made. And I'm calling this, for no reason other than giggles, the success ratio. Yes, so the success ratio is what I'm going to use to compare all of these devs. So let's just start with the straight who has the most subscribers. And then who has the most followers. And that right there tells you who has had the most success overall, right? I mean, if you're going to gauge success in any way, shape, or form, as far as marketing goes, the number of eyes that you have on your accounts or your channels, that's really the only way you can do it. But there's also per the amount of effort you put into it. And again, these numbers mean nothing. They really don't. They don't really mean a dang thing, because a million different things could be affecting these numbers. So like Wannabe Misha said, you really just have to keep working at it until something random happens, and then grab that opportunity by the horns. So here's how we all look on the graph for our reward versus our effort. What's interesting is where they are on the scale and why. Now, Jonas Tyroller, for example, has a lot of videos and has worked really hard. But they also had a very well-received game come out, and that sort of boosted them up higher than they may or may not have been without it. And Vimlark, for example, talked about how he gained a bunch of subscribers when, well, sadly, when the lockdown started. It's really interesting to look at where these people are on the scale and kind of figure out why. On my YouTube, for example, I've noticed that most people are finding me via the engine that I'm using. So, not surprisingly, I've titled some of my videos with the thing that's in the video, plus made in GDevelop, which has resulted in some of my highest viewed videos. And I think this is the meat of where marketing comes in, knowing what people are looking for and getting in the way of it. So when they come by looking for it, they catch you. And sometimes, that's just luck. But the favorite social media site of these developers was Twitter or YouTube. And it seems like the reason being is that there's much easier growth on both platforms. Something to take note though, if you're going to go with YouTube, is that videos take a long time to make. And this was expressed by a lot of the people involved here. YouTube videos take away time from your game development, which makes Twitter and other social medias more accessible and easier to use because it's really easy to just make a meme post. Like this one, for example, that I made that got 5,000 impressions, and it's literally just me saying, hey, I have a new idea, and not even mentioning what the idea is. So that's really the advantage of all these other social media sites, is it's a lot less work for a lot more views, but the quality of those views and the chance that they might come back and watch again or look you up later is a little bit less. So to recap, between all of us we've said, be everywhere, but focus on one spot. Show your rough work in progress, but also have good visuals. Market on Twitter, but also don't market on Twitter because it's mostly developers. make YouTube videos, but also don't make YouTube videos because they take too long to make. Personally, the only thing I'm going to take away from this video is
nobody knows anything.
If you enjoyed this video, maybe click on that subscribe button. And if you want to talk to me personally, the link to our Discord is down below. It's called the Game Dev Fireside, and it's a pretty chill place to hang out and talk game dev. And if you decide to click on that link, then I'll see you there.